Hey, you're listening or watching Tru Thoughts. I'm Robert Louis, and I'm joined by special guest Ed Gillett, who with this brilliant book, Party Lines. Hello, Ed. How are
Hey
you?
Rob, I'm really good, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
No, it's fascinating. It's going to be fascinating to talk to you because the book that you've done. Actually, should we get a little bit of context, a little bit of
Yeah,
history?
sure.
So I'd seen about the book. I think we ended up following each other, as often can happen on social media. And I sort of recognised the name, and I was like, I recognise the name, but couldn't quite place it. And then I was seeing the book about, and I thought, okay, that book looks interesting. And then I saw Sports Banger post up about the book, and I was like, I need to just check, really go into deep. What's this book about? And then ordered it straight away. And then we bumped into each other at We Out Here festival, didn't you? You
Yeah.
came up to me and introduced yourself, and I had forgotten, unfortunately, but you reminded me that the reason I recognised your name is because you had done work experience at Tru Thoughts. Is
Yeah,
that
yeah.
correct?
So I
Yeah.
was so people have kind of asked me like what's the inspiration for the book? Where does it all start? And it's very special for me to be talking to you about it because really it all starts with True Thoughts. So the big sliding doors moment in my life was so I was an intern at True Thoughts back in the old office in like when I was at university, so it would have been like early to mid 2000s. I would help out with running Phonic Hoop on a Saturday night and keep it unreal with Mr. Scruff on a Friday, and like it was an absolute dream come true. And anyway, so after doing that for a couple of summers, is it Paul, the guy that
Yeah,
that kind of
I own the label
yeah
with Paul. Yeah, Paul
that
Janis. Yeah.
runs True Thoughts with you, said, "Do you want a job?" And I had to make a decision about like doing that or going back to uni and getting my degree. And I chose the latter. And it's kind of this like big what if moment in my life. And through various kind of circuitous routes, I didn't go straight into journalism out of university. I started working in the charity sector for a number of different human rights organizations, but music's always been kind of my big love. And yeah, got into writing freelance journalism generally about kind of the bits where the music that I care about overlapped with politics, kind of taking that inspiration from my charity work, my human rights work. um, and yeah, eventually ended up with a kind of body of work that was enough to kind of put together into a kind of book proposal, building on kind of the freelance articles that I'd been writing and kind of expanding some of those narratives. The
What?
Sports Banger connection is via a documentary film that I worked on that was directed by a guy called Jeremy Deller, which is kind of history of dance music.
And that's a
Well,
brilliant
history.
documentary. That is a really great documentary as well, isn't it?
It's called Everybody in the Place. It was aired on BBC4 a couple of years ago, and that's kind of the like prehistory. So my journalism tends to look at the present day.
I think it's. I'm just going to interject for
Oh,
a bit. I think it is a good to go to finish at uni. I think one of the things that happened with me was I failed my first year at uni and thought I'm going to make it as a DJ. But then I think in hindsight, my mum put pressure on me to go back to uni. But I sort of also realised it's quite good if you're in that world to just get that degree and maybe do that. I think there's always opportunities later on in life, but I think
yeah.
enjoying that university lifestyle, particularly when you're young, is quite an education within itself, just away from the education, the
Oh,
learning, and that
yeah,
time.
100%. I mean, if I could go back in time, would I do it differently? No, I guess I've kind of got the best of both worlds now because, right, I've ended up writing about stuff that I love. We're chatting. Yeah, it feels like everything's kind of come full circle for me with the book, which is really nice.
Yeah. So to get into the book, one of the I mean, I've never read a book like it before, and it's fascinating. I bought it, and I told you we out here. I bought it for my holiday book, and I
Yeah,
was absolutely fascinated reading it. I kept saying to my wife, you're really articulating lots of things that were swirling around in my mind, but I'd never you put everything in context, and I was learning so much about the history. But if you were almost like the pitch, how would you describe the book? Because I guess the book sort of reads as a new interpretation of the history of dance music. I think a lot, which I picked up on, it's not the four people went to Ibiza and then the UK had dance music, and you've really written that in a brilliant way to for everybody to get the context. Was that the intention with this book? Was it the intention
yeah,
originally?
absolutely. It
Absolutely. Okay.
was. It was. Yeah, it was very much about trying to kind of broaden what's included in the history of dance music. So there are some great books out there that cover kind of would say that the first kind of 10 years of UK dance music, there's two books in particular that kind of inspire party lines. The first is called Energy Flash by Simon Reynolds, and the second is called Altered State by Matthew Collin. And they're both written in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they're kind of the first-hand canonical history of like UK dance music between like 1987 and 2002, say, really kind of focusing primarily on like 87 to 1994. And they're brilliant books. They're incredibly written. They've got so much detail in them. I love them both. But they are, I guess, partly by dint of them having been written first, they are kind of the canonical history. And I think, you know, dance music's been around for like 35, 40 years now. Those myths get really easily entrenched. And kind of the celebrities at the center of them become kind of put on a bit of a pedestal, and it's really easy, without anyone necessarily intending for this to be the case, for those myths to kind of get cemented in place. And obviously I'm a bit younger than those writers. I started going out dancing in the early 2000s. My whole experience of dance music is very different to the story in those books. And my understanding of the history, the period that those books cover, is kind of changed by the fact that I've come along as part of a later generation. I think a lot of the myths around dance music, again, not by design, but just because of the way society works, tend to focus disproportionately on white DJs and dancers and experiences, men rather than women, kind of straight DJs and dancers rather than kind of queer clubs and that whole culture. And I think there's, in the time since those canonical histories were written, I think there's a broader understanding of what dance music is, where it comes from, and who it, like, which communities it's connected to. So I wanted to kind of write a history. I wanted to write my own history of dance music, essentially, and specifically its kind of political and social aspects. So the area that I'm really interested in is not necessarily kind of what the music sounds like or which DJ played which record at which club. It's about like dance music, essentially a form of like a form of protest, a form of rebellion, a kind of power struggle between people wanting to like congregate together in places where they may not necessarily be allowed to congregate, where they might not have permission to gather, making lots of noise, kind of losing and finding themselves simultaneously. And then on the other hand, kind of the reaction that those kind of messy, noisy desires and urges and kind of collective forces, the reaction that prompts from the state, from the authorities, from kind of polite society. So Party Lines is essentially an attempt to kind of trace that history through all of dance music, and not just its kind of golden years, but all the way through to the present day. So, you know, for me, like, I'm still going out dancing now. Dance music is as vital and exciting as it's ever been. And histories that kind of tail off in 1994 feel like they kind of miss some of what's going on now. Like, for me, things like Boiler Room or the pandemic, like, are really, really critical parts of that history. So I wanted to make sure that kind of the present day was included. But I also, one of the things that I struggle with a little bit in the kind of canonical accepted wisdom around dance music is that it suddenly kind of exploded out of nowhere in 1987. It was Paul Oakenfold going to Ibiza and bringing kind of acid house back to the UK, and that's where it all started. And I think looking at that moment from, you know, almost 40 years into the future, what's really clear to me is actually the roots of dance music stretch back further than that. So like black reggae and dub sound systems and kind of the experiences of like Afro-Caribbean communities in the UK right the way from the Second World War through to the late 1980s are all really, really integral to that history.
You were showing, weren't you? I think one of the best things that I got from the book, I liked how you were talking about the Windrush generation and those early blues reggae parties, and then it just makes so much sense when Grime's going on as you're reading through the book. It's like, well, this is just so connected, but you also connect it with when I was younger in London in the sort of 80s. I was too young to go to clubs. I've went to a few in the mid-80s, but I was seeing, well, black music was playing house music, but it was playing it alongside, and it was all the whistles, like the clip of Soul Control with all the whistles. I remember going to that, and then it just suddenly seemed to be, oh, well, all of that is forgotten. And also what was going up north, they embraced house music before London did, really, in that bigger sense. And I think one of the best things that you wrote, which I really found fascinating, which I guess was in the back of my mind, but you were talking about Shaken Finger Pop and Family Function, and the warehouse parties are almost get forgotten about in the history of those big raves. And it's like, oh yeah, they really are part of it. And they're often, when the story's told of house, it's not mentioned at all, those illegal parties. I just wanted to interject, because it's like, I think if you haven't read the book, you really explain the history of how these all connect, and in each decade you're thinking, oh yeah, that's really just the same as what went on before. So you really connect everything in a brilliant, articulate way. So sorry to interrupt there, but yeah, I just wanted to interject saying that. So, yeah.
That's one of the things that definitely came out from kind of the writing and research process, that a lot of these struggles actually are the same kind of things played out in different spaces for different generations with maybe a different soundtrack. Like the reggae and dub blues parties that were happening in people's living rooms or in like community halls in the 50s and 60s, the police were kind of raiding and shutting down, or that people were running because they didn't have access to like licensed clubs, because there was essentially a kind of color bar. Like if you were a black DJ with a sound system, there's no way that your local white-owned pub in 1955 was going to let you throw a party there, right? So you had to use spaces that weren't otherwise like intended for those kind of uses. So that kind of social context is exactly the same as like kids in the 1980s using often the same sound systems, right? A lot of the rare groove DJs in the 80s who were playing kind of early Chicago house records at their parties, you know, they were the kids of people who'd run sound systems in the 50s and 60s, and they'd like inherit their parents' like speakers and amps, and then they'd run parties, but it'd have a slightly different soundtrack, and they'd run them in warehouses rather than in people's homes. And then rave comes along, and it's exactly the same thing, right? Like there isn't a licensed space for it. Like there are a couple of early acid house nights in clubs, but very quickly kind of demand for the scene grows and people are forced to start using alternative spaces. And they're, you know, using the same warehouses that the rare groove scene used and the same sound systems that the blues dancers used. There's this really, really clear kind of inheritance each time that stretches back like way longer than 1997. One of the people that I interviewed actually is, I mean, I'm not sure whether everyone would agree with this, but I interviewed him and he was involved in kind of the free party rave scene in the early to mid 1990s. He was also involved in the free festival scene in the 1970s, which is another one of kind of the influences on rave that I cover in the book. You know, kind of Stonehenge parties with like cork playing and that kind of scene. And his take was that struggle doesn't just go back to the 1970s or 1950s. It goes back right to kind of the dawn of human civilization and the conflict between nomadic communities who like move from place to place and who treat kind of physical space as this collective good that is available for everyone and belongs to no one, and you just kind of use it as you're moving through for whatever you want to do, and then you move on. And this kind of collective idea of how space is controlled and governed. And then on the other hand, you have kind of settled communities that say, okay, this patch of land belongs to us. This is where we are. This is where we're staying. And the conflict that arises when those two visions of how space is used meet in the same space. So one of our earliest myths, right? Cain and Abel. Cain was a farmer. Abel was a shepherd. Abel drives his flocks across Cain's field, so Cain kills him. It's generally understood as like a metaphor or an allegory for conflicts in like really early human civilization between nomadic and settled communities. It's like it's hardwired into us, and it's the same. You know, it's the same conflict when someone starts throwing an illegal rave in like a farm and their neighbors start complaining about the noise, right? It's those same underlying things. It's, you know, all the way through to like, I don't know, drill videos on YouTube and people getting offended and the police pulling them down. It's that same conflict just replayed in different forms all the way through. And that for me is the heart of what dance music is, right? It's this conflict between differing visions of how we use space, what space is entitled to be used for, like who gets to decide whether a party goes ahead or not, what it means for a community if it does or doesn't. Yeah, and that to me feels so much deeper and broader than just, you know, someone went to Ibiza and did ecstasy for the first time, and that's where it all comes from.
And there's a theme it feels through the book. I mean, it's the type of music I mean, a big hip hop fan, so I love that rebellious aspect of hip hop. But I think that's one of the themes that comes through all of with what's going on. There's brilliant creative music that's it happens because there's the mainstream political system is pushing down on these people, and then in a way you sort of show how then it crosses over to the mainstream, and you're very, I mean, you're very political and you're very honest, which sometimes often doesn't get mentioned within. I mean, I work in the music industry for a long time, and often it's not mentioned about. There's lots of people from very, very well-off backgrounds who are come in and then claim spaces of stuff that maybe 5 years ago was scaring, you know, them or their parents or the equivalent of them, and then suddenly these people can come in and claim those spaces and then monetize it over and above the people who were actually creating the music, and that conflict that goes on. It's brilliant how you show particularly with grime, which is, I guess, the more recent thing. I think one of the interesting things that I got from the book was it's very recent history. You can sometimes look back and go, Windrush generation, because they didn't have, it was really racist. But then I've got the note, was it Operation Paysac with the fake record shop? And so basically, maybe you could explain that a bit. And, you know,
that was a police operation in, where was it? I want to say it was in Newham, but it was certainly in sort of East London, possibly Haringey. And basically it was a sting operation. So the police set up a record shop and recording studio, and essentially used it as the whole thing was kind of bugged, wired for sound, and it was used. The people running it were undercover officers, and it was used basically to kind of draw in people that they suspected, or, you know, didn't even necessarily suspect of criminal activity, but just who happened to be passing through, and then use it to kind of gather evidence. And there's one particular case of a guy who was he was kind of an inspiring rapper, right? And he wanted cheap studio time, so the undercover officers running this space kind of met him and talked to him. He really looked up to them. Their kind of cover stories were really designed to kind of draw people in and be engaging. And they kind of mentored him, and he recorded some stuff in the studio, and, you know, viewed them as his kind of friends and teachers. And then one of them mentioned, "Oh, I've got a friend coming into town. Do you know anyone who might be able to get hold of some heroin?" And this guy didn't, but he asked around a couple of his friends, and he was like, "Okay, I think I can get hold of some." Bought like a bag of heroin, brought it to these people who he thought were his friends, and they immediately nicked him for possession with intent to supply. So it is a little murkier than that, because in fairness, the operation around that studio did also kind of sweep up some fairly serious kind of organized crime. I think it sees quite a lot of weapons based on intelligence that they'd gathered there. So it was not exclusively used to kind of entrap people who didn't deserve to be prosecuted, but there were certainly some cases that I think fit that description. And there's also something really unsettling about the use of a music space specifically. Like, I think if you look at opportunities available to young Black men in the UK, whether in the 1950s or the present day, those structural inequalities and disadvantages are still very, very present. Music is seen and acts as a way out for a lot of people, and
it was also done at the time when the Tories had pulled all the youth clubs as well, hadn't they? So they pulled the budgets from that. My sister-in-law used to work in that organisation, and then all the budgets got pulled. And I remember her telling me at the time, this is just going to lead to riots, which it did with Mark Duggan, the killing of him as well. I mean, it was really
2011. It was all the same time. It was all sort of in 2011 that this was happening, and there's something incredibly cynical about that, particularly given the way in which dance music, in particular, is so often used as a scapegoat for wider social ills. So you have, a couple of years before that, you have So Solid Crew used as this kind of avatar for urban decay, being blamed for shootings across the country, acting like their lyrics are inciting young people, specifically young Black people, to engage in violence, rather than considering that kind of music and that kind of creative expression as a reflection of kind of the violence that is inherent within society. It's a really good point that I spotted when I was researching. The then editor of the NME made the point at the time that way more CDs, So Solid Crew CDs, are being bought by like middle-class white teenagers in Swindon than like young Black teenagers in council estates. So if the music itself was the source of violence, you should have seen that violence replicated across society. The fact that it only ever is associated with a particular type of violence suggests that actually there's something else going on. So there's all these kind of interesting threads about the way that dance music is kind of used as a kind of contemporary folk devil, is the basis for all these kind of moral panics. But then, as you say, when it's presented in a slightly different way, it becomes something else entirely, right? 30 years ago, house and techno were viewed as this like demonic, corrupting force, all these young kids going out and listening to weird, unlistenable music and taking drugs. And, it was the collapse of civilization. And now, like, none of that really worries people. Like, going out clubbing is like a standard, completely accepted part of your average Saturday night out in any British city. And all of those fears have just transferred. So that, first it was jungle, then it was garage, then it was grime, now it's drill. Like again, it's the same kind of conflicts playing out in different spaces. It's just the kind of focus of it changes every couple of years.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I think for me, because it's more recent history, and you always hope and you think, oh, maybe things are changing, with Black Lives Matter, hopefully something and it will get through, but not in a bad way. But your book really was that reminder of this country is brilliant when it comes to creating music. I mean, I'm very biased. I mean, I'm an immigrant into this country. I came here when I was 4, but the fusion of what happens and creates all these brilliant scenes and brilliant genres of music that then gets exported to the world or influences the rest of the world is really amazing. But it's still continually done under quite oppressive sort of governments and politics, I feel. But it's maybe it just is the way it is. I don't know.
It's interesting. I think, dance music, like any other form of culture, reflects the society that it's created in. And I think, there are some really, really like positive changes that have happened in dance music in the last 10, 15 years. You've seen, I've certainly witnessed a growing kind of political engagement with dance music as a cultural and economic benefit to the UK. There's a bit in the book. So one of the sort of historical periods that I was really interested in exploring in more detail is kind of the super club era, which generally doesn't really get sort of detailed kind of political analysis as often as it should. So one of the first things that the Labour government did when they came to power in 1997 is they created the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, which previously, and I didn't realise this until I was kind of researching the book, previously had been the Office for National Heritage. So it was very much a kind of national trust, stately home, opera and ballet kind of vibe. New Labour come in and they immediately create DCMS, Culture, Media and Sport. And it's all about kind of, okay, how can we use these areas of artistic endeavour or creativity to help build the British economy. So they put together this kind of policy paper that and it's very kind of interesting on a like philosophical level, which essentially argues that like art, music, design, architecture, all of these different kind of creative industries, they're not good just because they bring us joy and make our cities beautiful and interesting. There is a cold, hard economic imperative behind all of this, that if we harness this energy, we can use it to drive investment in the UK, or we can use it to regenerate areas of the country that maybe have been left behind. And there's this huge kind of political and economic investment across the cultural industries, but with dance music in particular. You see people like Lord Palumbo, who ran Ministry of Sound, like become very closely connected with New Labour and then subsequently the Lib Dems. You see kind of super clubs like Cream become these kind of real kind of emblematic spaces for their city, kind of similar to the way that a football club is kind of a stand-in for a like local civic identity. Green becomes very like connected to the local political establishment, and then becomes this kind of national brand and then international brand. And yeah, you can see those kind of economic levers in action through to the present day, right? You've now got lots of discussions around the nighttime economy and different cities kind of emphasizing nightlife as a way to bolster local economies, to help boost kind of income from tourists. Like in Brighton in the 90s, there was, Big Beat was kind of essentially like a calling card for the city, right?
Put Brighton on the map in a way, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Hadn't been for a while since the mod era. That was suddenly there was this massive injection of what's happening.
That creates lots of really great opportunities. That additional kind of political and economic buy-in isn't necessarily always a bad thing, but it kind of shifts inevitably the way that a culture operates, and certain audiences, certain operators, certain forms of culture tend to benefit, and others that don't necessarily fit that model risk kind of missing out on some of that. So it creates kind of inequalities within the system just because there's suddenly like more interest, and that inevitably kind of exerts a bit of a gravitational pull on how the sound and the culture kind of operate.
An interesting thing in the book that I hadn't quite realised, which bringing it up to date, I think which is maybe the roots of that, is you're also highlighting how it almost seems now to be a political thing to bring these clubs and this business into areas that are run down with the view that make it happen, and then we're just going to build loads of flats and expensive flats in there, which I had no idea was going on. I was still in that mood of, this is happening from the ground. People are taking all these spaces just from the ground up, but it's quietly, it's a very political and moneyed system in place, isn't it? Which I guess people going to what's jungle or aren't really realizing, there's a really bigger system that's really using music and underground music, and then I get lost now, we don't want you here anymore.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So one of the things that's kind of shifted, I think, with dance music in the present day, certainly over sort of the last 5-10 years, if you look back to the 90s, I think, and this is a wild generalization, but I think in general it holds true. There was a fairly clear distinction, like sonically and aesthetically, between kind of the mainstream and the underground, right? Like you would have generally like your big super clubs would tend to play your kind of commercial house music and your big shiny trance or, big beat or whatever. It was sort of popular genres occupied mass market spaces. Generally, underground spaces tended to play kind of more out there stuff, more experimental stuff. You could tell by looking at and listening to a club who it was catering to and what kind of rung of the economic ladder it occupied. Today, I think those distinctions have become quite blurred. So you'll have clubs booking really weird experimental names, catering to this quite underground audience, but behind the scenes they are just as commercially driven, if not more so, than the biggest, shiniest, cheesiest super clubs of the 90s era. So one of the things that's been really difficult throughout dance music's history is finding appropriate spaces to dance in, whether that's a lack of licensed venues or restrictions on who can use licensed venues and the need to use kind of warehouses or people's front rooms or whatever. In more recent years, that's been affected by kind of urban gentrification and redevelopment. So clubs that move to an area of a city that is a bit run down, where rents are cheap, and maybe there are venues that are unoccupied, or business premises that could be converted into venues. Then loads of people kind of start going to those parties. Loads of artists and creatives move in. The neighborhood gets a reputation for being kind of cool and edgy. And then suddenly you start seeing like luxury apartment blocks being built, and you get a little Waitrose and like your artisan bakery. Rents go up, everyone gets kind of forced out to the next area further out from the center, and then the whole process repeats again. And you've seen plenty of venues over the last sort of 10, 15 years close as a result of that. So either rents have become too high, or councils have decided that actually there's a bit too much kind of late night activity going on in a particular neighbourhood. I can think particularly of Dalston in East London as an area which 10 years ago was a real kind of hotbed of musical culture. And now the number of clubs there has been really thinned down, and that's been quite a deliberate policy by Hackney Council to kind of try and limit the amount of late night noise and disorder and mess caused by late night venues, but without really kind of accounting for the cultural and economic value that those spaces provide. But yeah, so that process of that kind of tug of war between kind of gentrification and cultural activity has been ongoing throughout dance music's history. What's new is this kind of strategy of trying to kind of short circuit that problem by promoters working directly with developers. So a lot of very big clubs in the UK are run along essentially a kind of developer funded model. So big examples would be Printworks in London, Drum Sheds, which is just about to open, Depot Mayfield, which is where a warehouse project happens in Manchester. I'm not sure if there's any in Brighton, but there may well be. And that all three of those venues and a dozen or so more are all run by one company called Broadwick Live, who are not the only company working along this model, but they were kind of the first in that space. They're the biggest in the UK in that space, and they're a good kind of example of how it works. So they're funded not really, well, their funding doesn't come solely from kind of running events and selling tickets and operating in the way that a normal promoter would operate. A lot of their funding comes from the property development and construction industries. So a big developer will buy up a site. With Printworks, it was the old printing works. It was a massive factory that used to produce the Evening Standard and the Daily Mail in southeast London. The Daily Mail moved their printing operations. They sold the site to British Land. British Land wanted to redevelop it into flats and offices, but obviously that takes a lot of time. You know, you have to get architects involved. You have to draw up all the plans. You have to apply for planning permission. You have to schedule everything. So they brought in Broadwick Live to run a venue, Printworks, on that site for 5 years. And the plan was that it would run for 5 years. You would put Surrey Quays, the neighbourhood that the Printworks was in, on the map. You'd have like loads of young people with disposable income coming to this area going, oh, Surrey Quays is suddenly cool. And then at the end of that 5 years, club closes, building gets demolished, up go the flats and offices, and suddenly you've got, you know, new economic activity. And again, it's much like the sort of political buy into dance music. There are benefits to that. Like Printworks was a great venue. I went there several times, had lots of fun. But it was always going to close, and I think that's tricky in that it's not always immediately clear to people that that's the model that things are operating on.
Yeah.
So
I had no idea. I didn't know that this is how all of this.
Well, I don't think a lot of people did. Yeah. So when Printworks announced that it was closing, so it was very interesting. British Land, who were the property developers that were working with Broadwick Live, put in for planning permission with plans that made it very clear that there wasn't going to be a club on the new site. And nobody noticed for 9 months or so. And then Printworks announced that they were going to be closing. So I think planning permission was granted. And so they said, okay, we're going to be closing. They initially planned to close in 2022, and then it got pushed back to 2023. And everyone was up in arms. They were like, oh my God, Printworks is going to close. We love it. And they started mounting this campaign. The owners of Printworks, Broadwick Live, very noticeably didn't get involved in that campaign because it's part of their whole business model, right? You run this space for 5 years, it gets knocked down, you move on to the next one, you gradually kind of build your portfolio, you work with these developers, they give you a chunk of cash to run this venue, and then you put on events and you build your brand that way. To give them fair credit, Printwork, the part of the reason why Broadway Live didn't get involved in that campaign was because they were involved in kind of behind the scenes negotiations to try and keep some sort of venue on the new site. But I think a club in a disused print factory is very, very different to a club in the basement of a block of luxury flats, right? It's inherently going to be different. Like the model is very much to use the clubs as kind of that first wave of gentrification in a given area, and then to replace it with something else. And obviously we're in the middle of a massive housing crisis, so building more flats is a good thing. Having these spaces, even if it's only for 3 or 4 or 5 years, you know, so you get to experience this brilliant music in these amazing spaces, is a good thing. But I think there is a trade-off there, and I think the sort of the types of culture that benefit from that ecosystem are very particular. So often these are quite big spaces because they have to be, because that's the sort of spaces that developers go for. So you have, you know, Printworks was, I think, 5,000 capacity Drum Sheds, which is a new venue by Broadwick Live on the site of an old IKEA in Tottenham. That's, I think, going to be 10 or 15,000 capacity. It's not, you know, small grassroots operators and small grassroots venues that are benefiting from this influx of money. I saw a really, really good tweet when the opening of Drum Sheds was announced that said that London doesn't need a 15,000 capacity club. It needs like 5 1,000 capacity clubs, 10 500 capacity clubs. You know, and I think there's some merit in that point of view. I think obviously any kind of decision that gets made about how nightlife is supported and funded, there are going to be winners and losers. You know, I'm not sure you could fix all of this without entirely dismantling capitalism and reframing society in a completely new way, which is, you know, slightly beyond my pay grade to design and advocate for.
I think what you show though there is that it's good to know this is going on, because I had no idea. And then because I do feel the spirit, the great music that we get from this country it comes from maybe getting into spaces that you just claim and over. This seems a little bit that there's a picture, and you worry if the next maybe it's not, maybe that's the situation. As you said, they are getting those underground things. It's not like the old school Mecca clubs where it was just you know, Radio 1 mainstream DJs playing there. It seems to be, you know, getting those underground people there. And as someone who runs a label, look, yeah, if we've got an underground artist and they've got an opportunity to play at 10,000, and you go, oh, that's amazing.
100%,
it's really
amazing. 100%. It's not, and one of the things that I tried to do with the book is not be kind of super black and white. I think it's pretty obvious when you're reading it where my kind of loyalties and sympathies lie. But I don't discount the fact that, like, having somewhere for underground artists to progress towards is a really good thing. Like, I think it's great that there are, you know, 5,000, 10,000 venues out there. It's just, so one of the things that you see economically in dance music over the last 10, 15 years is a real shrinking of the number of kind of grassroots independent venues. And a lot of the kind of income that economic activity generated by dance music is increasingly taken up by kind of large venues and festivals, and much less of it is being earned by your kind of local high street club.
Tru Thoughts as a label, we was built on the back of me doing a small, you know, I did a small club before I started Tru Thoughts. There was 150 venue. I did it every Wednesday while I was a student. Then we did Phonic Hoop, which was just over 200. And then me and Paul, for the first 5-6 years of the label, we didn't take a penny out of the label. We paid some wages to the people working for us, and then we just lived off the income we were getting with the club. And then every penny we earned stayed within the label for those first 5 years. It almost seems nowadays, if I look at what goes on in Brighton, it seems a bit more difficult to maybe the model that we were able to do to fund our record label is a lot tougher maybe nowadays for somebody just, you know, can where do you go, first of all? Which venue can you go? We went a venue that wasn't particularly well used, but we got it, because we just said, look, we can take that space on a Thursday. You've never had a successful night ever in this venue, and we just brought a crowd in there. But are you worried? You look at Brighton, not gentrification, but as it picked up in the 90s, there's a few organisations that own a lot of the venues. It can be a bit difficult. How do you get in there? How do you get a venue owner to trust you and say, give me 2 months to do a weekly night and get a crowd going? Or don't sack me if the first 4 nights are quiet. I don't know. It's a difficult situation.
I know plenty of promoters who have been like objectively successful, great reviews, regular sellouts, and have either found it difficult working with venues or have not been able to find a consistent venue that they can have a home in. I know plenty of people who've run labels who, have been squeezed by the changes in the music industry over the last 20 years. So I do think that the landscape is far more hostile now than it's been. You look at Warp Records, right? Like they started off, they sold was it 150,000 copies of LFO by LFO, and that was kind of the catalyst for them to kind of grow as a label. Even someone like Dizzy and Wiley, selling white labels out of the boot of their car, that economic infrastructure for people right at the very bottom to start kind of building their business and their brand, I think it's not completely disappeared. There are things like Bandcamp, which are really great, although Bandcamp has now just, I think in the last couple of days, been sold to a kind of massive global music marketing company. So there are still opportunities there, but I do think the landscape is more hostile. I guess the thing that gives me a certain amount of optimism, and this is something that I tried to do with the last chapter of the book. So those other kind of canonical histories of dance music end on a little bit of a downer, and I really, really didn't want to do that. I wanted to be really positive about the future of UK dance music. I think one of the things that is really positive is that dance music has always thrived in the margins, right? All of the most interesting advances in UK dance music, whether that's kind of politically or sonically, have always come from the people making it being kind of backed into a bit of a corner. Not that we should glorify or glamorize that. If unequal, unfair things are happening, we should call it out. But there's also, I don't think we should be afraid of dance music having to kind of be underground and work out how it survives, because dance music's a bit of a cockroach in that sense, right? You can blow up a nuclear bomb and it'll still be scurrying around. People will still be going out raving.
I found it really inspiring at the end. It was, at the end of the book, for me, it just really reminded me, having gone through the whole book, I just felt, it shows it's okay. What you do in the book is show it's okay to be an underground DJ, an underground booker, make those brave decisions. And I think I really loved how, as well, it's just maybe a small line in the book, but you had a famous Todd Edwards footage of him in Romford, how he looks quite nervous, and he's doing that, which is sort of that antithesis of the arms in the air, just all cameras on me. And I think that's the bit that I just still really, I like, and I want to encourage. I've just recently done some mentoring, and I particularly said, look, I want to reach out if you're a bit more of an introvert, because I feel I'm an introvert DJ. I'm very nervous. I've had, when I had my Sonic Switch, I had quite a few people approach about, can we film the night? And I was like, well, you're going to have lights on me. I want it to be dark in there. I don't want you to, can you film in the darkness? No, we can't. Okay. Then I was like, no, look, I just want it to be, you can't see anybody because I have all the lights off. And and it was really interesting with all the people who applied, they all pretty much said the same. Oh yeah, I love music. And when I'm chatting to them, they're all, I'm into the music. They're not about, I want a camera on me. They want to do that. And I think you're very good in the book about reminding people, look, remember this. So
that's, in addition to kind of the physical spaces that dance music occupies and the way that that's shifted with kind of the roles of property developers, I think the virtual spaces that dance music occupies are really interesting as well. So the way that kind of the grammar of performance, of being a DJ, has shifted in the last 20 years as a result of cameras being in the rave more regularly, platforms like Boiler Room making DJing kind of a visual rather than just a sonic spectacle. In the book, the Todd Edwards clip, is one of my favorite bits of kind of archive footage for anyone who hasn't seen it. Check it out on YouTube. And yeah, it's Todd Edwards' first gig in the UK. I think it's possibly his first DJ gig of any kind ever. So he was, you know, successful briefly in the US in the 90s and then kind of faded into obscurity. And then when sort of speed garage became a thing over here, because he uses all these kind of chopped up vocal samples, his tunes worked really well pitched up to like +8. So loads of UK DJs got into it. He became this kind of like mythical, legendary figure. No one really knew who he was. And then he came over and played his first gig in Romford on like New Year's Day 2000, I think, maybe 2001. And the video is this guy, like, clearly totally unprepared for the adoration that's raining down on him. These people are going absolutely mad for it. And he's just kind of grinning inanely and very awkwardly and kind of, yeah, it's very, very sweet and very, really like affecting and exciting. And you kind of feel that energy there. And I compare it to two other clips, of like two other UK garage DJs, each kind of a couple years on from that. So the first one is DJ EZ playing for Boiler Room in, I think, 2009, so kind of 8 years afterwards. And his DJ style is like very technical, and it's like all of these kind of incredibly cool, like kind of spin backs and flicks and like messing around with the faders. And yeah, it's amazing to watch. It's like someone doing kind of like close-up magic where you can't quite follow his hands. And there's this amazing bit where he's playing Battle by Wookie, and he like loops the vocal and then is like triggering something on a CDJ and like playing it kind of up and down the pitch fader. And then he like cuts Battle and drops the next tune, and everyone just goes absolutely crazy. And it's this moment that's kind of been enshrined in Boiler Room folklore. It was at a point when they were just beginning to kind of break out and become this huge kind of media brand, just beginning this kind of process of expanding from like three mates in a warehouse with a webcam to like the beating heart of global dance music culture. And yeah, you can see kind of the shift from like Todd Edwards, who isn't really comfortable being watched, to like DJ EZ being like a very visual performer, and the way that gets monetized, and the way that shifts kind of what people expect from dance music and what dance music can do. And then the third clip is from like a festival in Croatia in like, I think, 2022. It's really interesting. It's like a sort of novelty UK garage set. So it's two DJs who don't normally play garage, playing all the same tunes that DJ EZ was playing kind of 10 years before, and Todd Edwards was playing 10 years before that. And they're doing all the kind of like EZ-y, like wiggling around on the mixer, but nothing's really happening to the music. So there's this kind of disconnect. So you've got like all of EZ's performative kind of skill kind of like replicated, but without anything to kind of base it on. So what you, and obviously it was like filmed for the label that ran the festival, and it's all very glossy and very glitzy, and you can see the DJs kind of like they're very comfortable being watched. That's completely the opposite of Todd Edwards, where he has no idea what he's doing. They know exactly what they're doing. It's all very professional. It's very slick, and that's all the product of like how being viewed changes the way that kind of dance music operates, and how it's monetized as well. I think it's a really powerful encapsulation of the way that investment and money and audience size shifts the way that dance music is performed, it's consumed, what it means, who it caters to. Yeah, it's so that's one little sort of, I guess, case study within the book.
Yeah. And even at the end, I like that you were talking about Daytimers and other collectives, and just it's because you reference what happened with Kiss FM and almost Hitman and Her, the mainstreamification, if that's even a word, of dance music, and then you sort of, I thought it could just give some really good advice to the next generations that are maybe coming through. I mean, I chat to Rohan at Daytimers a little bit, and it's fascinating what goes on there. And it seems like, to me, from the outside, they're almost like that. They're trying not to be, he calls it, the tick the brown card, or, be like that. And it feels like there people are understanding, maybe what's gone on. and what is happening now. But I think the book, it just brilliantly articulates that. For me, I'd really advise anybody, if you're into, genuinely underground music or trying to make it, I think it's always important to know the history of where anything comes from. And this is the first book that I've really seen that just really distills what's gone on in the UK and what we're about and why we are today. And there's so many inspiring stories in there. I mean, to me, I love Lloyd Bradley bass culture, and to me that was just a groundbreaking book, because it made me, I loved reggae and sort of understood, the bits and stories, but then when he really explained it, if anybody who's a DJ says, I don't really like reggae, I always say to them, you've got to read bass culture, because if you're a DJ, that's why you're a DJ. And Lloyd Bradley did it really well. I think it feels like an important book, this, to me. I don't know if there are other ones. Yeah, it feels.
Yeah, there's loads of other books that inspired this. So Lloyd's writing is really, really key. Actually, in terms of when you mentioned the rare groove scene, there's a brilliant book by an author called Caspar Melville. It's called It's a London Thing, and it's rare groove, jungle, something else I can't, but it basically it's really, really good on that link between kind of sound system culture in the 70s via rare groove into it's rare groove, acid house, and jungle, how they kind of shaped London culture, and it's that's a really, really vital book. There's a great book on grime by an author called Dan Hancock's, which really kind of frames grime in kind of its political context. There's a great book by an author called Joy White. It's called Terraformed. It focuses very specifically on a single neighborhood in East London, but it looks at the way that kind of grime and drill play a role in the lives of kind of young black men in that neighborhood. There's loads and loads of great journalism. I think with Party Lines, I wasn't necessarily kind of breaking the mold with anything. It's none of this stuff is really new. I think what I was trying to do with it was kind of condense it into a history that maps like the whole kind of the length of dance music that kind of joins the dots between all those different ideas and those themes and those different kind of genres. I think that stuff like grime and drill, stuff like blues parties in the 1950s or free festivals in the 1970s, they're all part of the same history, and they all deserve their place kind of in the canon, right, in the official kind of UK dance music timeline. And stuff that's going on today, like I think Daytimers are a really wonderful example of like how those historical threads all connect together. So obviously they take their name from the Daytimers scene in the early 90s, the kind of daytime parties for almost exclusively Asian kids playing kind of Bhangra and hip hop and house, so that they're kind of borrowing from that history but doing something very different with it. It was really interesting when I chatted to them. One of the things that really stood out to me was that for them, it's not just about throwing parties. So there were two things that kind of came out of that final chapter, and one of them was a sense of kind of smallness, so staying underground, deliberately not growing beyond a certain size. And the other one was this sense of kind of the meaning of dance music expanding beyond the boundaries of the dance floor. So Daytimers had like a big hypey boiler room moment, and they got lots of press coverage, and that was great. But actually, that's not really what they're interested in. What they're interested in is building like a really resilient community, finding links between different artists and audiences, predominantly of South Asian or Southeast Asian heritage, providing mentoring opportunities, educational opportunities, employment opportunities, skill sharing, networking, like building this kind of collective resource that isn't dependent on kind of mainstream media or mainstream funding. The way they described it was like, we don't want to keep like fighting over our own little slice of the pie. We want to go away and bake our own pie, which I think is, dance music is kind of a mature culture now. It's 35, 40 years old. People are recognizing that there are different ways of doing things, that there are different options out there, that there are different examples throughout dance music history of other ways to think about things, other ways to approach things. And hopefully Party Lines will contribute to people kind of understanding that history a little bit better and recognizing that there are all these great opportunities outside of that process to kind of break that cycle of co-option and commercialization. And it was really interesting. One of the book talks that I did, I had these people come up to me afterwards, these two like very excitable 22-year-olds who were chatting to me about this like scene that they and their friends had been involved in because they all just love Gabba. They did really, really love listening to Gabba. So they started like throwing these parties for like them and 20 of their mates. And they did it for like 6 months. And then by the time it got to like 50 people coming through the door, they were like, no, this is too commercial. Don't want to do this anymore. This is strayed too far from its roots. We're going to go off and do something else. And I really like, I loved that there was this like tiny little dance music ecosystem that I knew nothing about, that had just kind of done what it needed to do. And then people went off and did something else. They didn't feel like they needed to like work out a brand strategy or get their, slot on Boiler Room or wherever. Like they were just, and I think that's a really beautiful thing, like knowing that you can take what you need from this culture and build it into whatever you can imagine, rather than conforming.
You become a building block, don't you? And I think I always see that. I know when Broken Beat was first came through, and I remember chatting to Domu, and he was getting a bit frustrated about how it's hard to make a living, and I can't, we're not selling loads. And I was like, because I was like, well, this is just, it's the equivalent of rare groove. It's just brilliant music and you're laying foundations for things. But he was like, yeah, but I'm going to have to get a proper job. But I totally understand that. And then, but where I see what goes on today, you see people like a new generation who are discovering those records. And when I went to We Out Here, you could see like the young people playing Afro-Naut tune, and I'm like, oh, God, they've found these tunes, it's not like, and it just goes on. And sometimes you have to be grateful to just be part of a story, isn't it? We can't all have our Boiler Room moments or play at the 10,000 capacity festival, but I think what Party Line shows is that you're part of the history and the story. You might not be written about in Mixmag or something, but you could be part of it still and have your contribution and have great memories from, like those Gabba guys. I bet they're going to have memories in 10, 15 years time about that, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. It's gonna, that's the beautiful thing about it. And I think that's, if I think kind of more deeply about like what I want my writing to do, like I really hope it contributes to kind of a broadening of the canon. So like obviously I'm writing from a white male perspective. I think there's lots of space for kind of broader, more diverse voices to add to that kind of lineage. But I also think there's value in me saying, someone like me saying, actually, the story is not just about like white men, that actually it should be on all of us to broaden that canon. So that's one of the things I'm hoping it'll do.
You're not afraid of speaking up about all of this, and as a white man, it's good that you're saying that, because I think we all need allies for you to say that, because if you're brown or black, people can know you're just saying that, you've got a chip on your shoulder and all that, but you're very vocal in the book about this as well, which I think is
which I think is, that's not, the solution is not for people like me to be louder about that. It's for everyone to have a space to discuss this. But I do think in terms of like what I can do with the platform I have, I've tried to do positive things with it. But also that I hope it more broadly contributes to an understanding that dance music isn't just this kind of, well, it didn't just start in 1987. It didn't stop being political in 1994. It's not just about superstar DJs and big clubs and the nighttime economy, that actually there's a whole other parallel history that's incredibly vital, that means a huge amount to people. Like Broken Beat was the music that made me fall in love with dance music when I was a teenager. So like that's inspired this, right? There's all these different kind of ripples that come out in different directions. And that you don't have to be a Peggy Gou or a Paula Oakenfold. Like that actually being a Seiji is like just as important, right? And just as valid and just as valuable. That actually dance music's power doesn't come from what it sounds like or how much money it generates. Its power comes from assembling people in a space and like helping them form a community of whatever kind, of understanding themselves and other people better, of offering some kind of alternative to the status quo, even if it's just for a night, or indeed even if it's for a lifetime. That's kind of where the really inspiring, exciting stuff happens.
Well, another really important part for me personally from reading the book that I found, I with everything going on recently with the Tories and power, when Boris Johnson just got back in, I was like really down, and I was saying to my wife, why don't people understand? And I was going, why, when we had the poll tax, because I was that generation, we didn't pay the poll tax. I remember being at university and my, quite well-to-do middle-class friends were like, oh, I'm going to pay, I'm scared about not paying. I was like, no, don't pay it. You don't have to pay it. And a lot of people on my course didn't pay it. And you could see they were a little bit scared about doing it, but it felt like, oh, we are all joining together. And I was thinking it felt like there was a bigger sort of moment going on, as a revolution in a way. But I think what you said at the end of the book, when you just said, I think you sort of wrote, you're not sure that's going to be the way. It's going to be the pockets now, isn't it? It's not necessarily possible. And to me, that made me feel a bit better about, okay, maybe I'm supposed to now think, oh, look, oh yeah, there's all these little things. They're all the good things. We're not necessarily all going to join together in one big swoop, but we can all do our little bits,
So it's interesting. There's a sort of moment in the mid-90s where dance music becomes, this huge kind of part of a much broader political campaign. So the free party scene in the early 90s leads to the Castle Morton Free Festival in May of 1992, which was the biggest illegal rave in UK history, kind of 40,000 people on a common in Gloucestershire for a week. It was the lead item on the 6 o'clock news, which had precisely the opposite impact. So there were all these kind of scare stories about 30,000 people gathering for free to dance and do loads of drugs. Isn't it awful? And of course, anyone under the age of 25 with access to a car was like, that sounds brilliant. Where do I go? So it inadvertently ended up kind of recruiting people to come to the party. But it was this huge kind of media outrage, political outrage as well. So the Criminal Justice Act gets brought in 1994. Rave was kind of used as one of many reasons to bring in vast new police powers across all different areas of British life. And there was a huge kind of campaign against it, of which the rave scene was a really, really strong part. So one of the clauses in the bill brought in new powers to illegalise, I'll try and remember the exact wording, it's gatherings taking place at night featuring amplified music characterized by the emission of a succession of repetitive beats. So it was the first attempt to kind of explain what dance music is in law. Weirdly, Autechre, the IDM group, produced a kind of protest record called Flutter, and no two bars of the drum programming were the same. And the liner notes say, this record doesn't include any repetitive beats, so it should be legal under the new law. We advise that you have a lawyer and a musicologist present at your illegal rave in case the police turn up. But yeah, so there was this big moment, and there were all these marches through like Trafalgar Square and down Whitehall, and this really close kind of alliance between the illegal rave scene and also the squatting movement, hunt saboteur movement, environmental protest groups, a lot of which kind of ended up feeding into Reclaim the Streets. Ultimately kind of leads to like the Occupy movement, student protests. It's that sort of world, and dance music was right at the center of it for a while. And then after the Criminal Justice Act gets passed, it kind of, that energy kind of diffuses. People go off and kind of do other things. The raving scene kind of pivots to licensed venues. Everyone starts going to super clubs, and now like that political energy is a little more diffuse. So there was recently another kind of Criminal Justice Act type bill, more restrictions on squatting, more restrictions on the right to protest. And it was really interesting that the rave scene wasn't really a part of that movement because they weren't directly threatened by it. They were, more interested in making sure that venues reopened after COVID. So there was a huge kind of rave-themed protest march in the summer of 2021. So I think the political priorities of kind of dance music as a whole maybe have shifted. But
yeah, I mean, you mentioned in that protest, I think one of the people involved tweeted, "Oh, that was really good because there was no politics."
Yeah, which is a weird thing to tweet after a protest, right? So I think some of the kind of the political kind of connotations of dance music have shifted quite a lot in the years since the Criminal Justice Act was passed. But for me, kind of dance music is always inherently political, right? Like it goes back to the hunter-gatherers versus the farmers, gathering people in a space to make loads of noise late at night is inherent. Like even if it's not deliberately a political act, like it has political implications, whether you are a little grassroots organizer, whether you are a huge multinational company, like it functions politically in one way or another. So there's always going to be kind of political and social energy generated by our desire to go out and get off our faces and dance together. And that, that's still really, really visible, even if it's, rather than one 30,000 person rave, there are 300 parties across the UK, each with 100 people there. They're still generating the same kind of energy, just in a different way. And I do think there are obviously huge challenges facing dance music, as there are all forms of culture, that's related to a political establishment that doesn't really get or care about young people, doesn't really get or care about culture in any other sense than economically, that views any kind of alternative mode of social organizing as a threat to its grip on power. All of those risks exist. But there will always be kind of an alternative to them. And I think dance music will continue to play a really, really vital role in catalyzing and energizing those alternatives, giving it a soundtrack and a place to be, if nothing else. So yeah.
You highlight as well within that the situation with drugs, which is so archaic in general. I mean, I know it's a corny thing to say, but if you watch The Wire, it really explains why it's just a nonsense having illegal drugs. But through a story arc, through the book, it feels to me about it just seems nonsensical. I mean, particularly, I guess most people know Boris Johnson, David Cameron took drugs. Why? It's not, it's so backwards. And I think, there's funny stories in there with interesting but funny stories with the way that judge was saying to the dance academy in Bristol, saying you should, to stop drug taking, you should play Strictly Come Dancing music, and that would stop it. And it's like, wow, this is someone in power, doesn't understand at all what is going on, and he put those people in prison. It's so strange sometimes what the laws in this country. So
the drugs thing is an interesting one. So the documentary that I worked on with Jeremy Deller, the format for it was to get a load of kind of old archive rave footage and present it to a class of kind of sixth form politics students in a North London comprehensive in 2018. And because of that setup, we weren't really able to talk about drugs. There were, all sorts of safeguarding issues around talking to school children about it. And it was one of the things that people picked up on, that, there's no drugs in it. But I do think that the story kind of works without drugs at its center. And I guess one of the things that I wanted to do, there's a whole chapter on kind of drugs in Party Lines. But what I wanted to do differently was not start with that kind of subjective experience of being on ecstasy. So a lot of the Energy Flash, Altered State type books, other kind of histories of dance music, put like ecstasy right at the center. Either they'll have it in the title, or they'll that'll be that moment of kind of taking your first pill will be the moment that everything suddenly changes. And for me, the connection between dance music and drugs is slightly different. Like, it's not just about being on drugs. There's another really, really good book called Dance Your Way Home by Emma Warren, which is essentially a sort of autobiography through dance music and the different dance floors she's danced on. It's a beautiful book. But she talks about the fact that, she was going out raving in the late 80s and didn't do ecstasy at all. Like, from her perspective, it's kind of a myth that everyone was on pills, because her and all of her mates were just like really connected to that feeling of kind of dancing together. And actually that's a really transformative kind of almost drug-like experience, even if you're not doing any drugs. And actually, when I looked into the stats, it kind of bears it out. So ecstasy usage in the UK peaked in 2001 with, I think it was like 1.8% of people said that they had taken ecstasy in the entire preceding year. And even if you look at the stats just for kind of 25 to 34-year-olds, so the people that we think of as like the chemical generation, the figure there was 5%. So that's 5% of young people having done a pill at some point in the preceding 12 months, which was way lower than you would think from the space that ecstasy occupies in the conversation. I mean, that 5% still equates to 500,000 people. So it's not a small amount of people. But I think for me, it's less about kind of what it feels like when you take a pill and listen to dance music, and more about kind of the economic and political kind of implications of that. So the way that prohibition kind of affects the quality of drugs on UK dance floors, the way that differing levels of different drugs will have an impact on kind of trends in dance music. So there was a huge MDMA drought in sort of 2008, 2009. There was this massive raid in Cambodia on one of the chemicals used to make MDMA. There was a huge clampdown in China on another chemical that could be used to make pills from. And it was really, really hard to get ecstasy in the UK. And so everyone pivoted to ketamine. And then you get like the music kind of slowing down and getting flatter, and or people listening to dubstep and being kind of very wavy, and like you can hear it sounding more ketamine-y. And then in 2010, 2011, a new way of synthesizing MDMA is worked out. A huge kind of flood of extremely pure MDMA into the UK. And suddenly, bang, house and techno are back. They're the big thing. There's this huge revival. It's really interesting, those kind of threads and connections. I guess there's plenty of things that I get frustrated by or critical about in dance music, whether it's, you know, clubs closing or inequalities in the stories we tell. But the one thing that gets me absolutely livid is drug policy. I wrote a piece for DJ Mag a couple of years ago looking at drug safety measures when clubs were reopening post-COVID. And there was this really interesting kind of confluence of factors that made it a particularly dangerous time. So you had lots of people who turned 18 during the pandemic who were going out to clubs for the first time. You know, just a whole year and a half's worth of people who've been waiting to, you know, get into Fabric or Warehouse Project or whatever, going for their first big nights out. You had a bunch of other people who hadn't been allowed to go clubbing for a year and a half and whose tolerances for drugs will have dropped off. People were still like smoking weed and maybe doing a bit of acid in their living room, but they certainly weren't buying loads of pills or amphetamines for obvious reasons. So their tolerance will have dropped a lot. You also had an illegal distribution network where it was really, really difficult to get hold of drugs. So you remember we had like shortages of KFC chicken and McDonald's milkshakes, right? It's completely understandable that the black market would have those same constraints as kind of society kind of started getting back to normal. And you also had dealers and a whole like economic infrastructure in the drug trade where people had not been making any profit for 18 months. So you had, it's really hard to get hold of drugs. There was an inbuilt economic incentive for dealers to cut their drugs with weirder substances. And you had like drug taking populace that was far more vulnerable to overdoses or to accidentally taking too much or taking the wrong type of stuff than ever before. And this was widely known in advance. All of the kind of organizations working on drug safety were shouting about this from like the end of 2020, beginning of 2021, saying, look, clubs are going to reopen, we've got a vaccine now, we're getting back to normal. When this happens, you're going to have problems. And the government held they had a all-party parliamentary group on licensing, and they talked about this very openly, and their recommendation was you need to have public-facing drug testing legally available. You need to start putting the laws and regulations in place now so that people can get their drugs checked when they go to a festival or a club when they reopen, because that's what works. You look at the example of cities like Amsterdam, where they brought in, I think across Holland, they brought in public-facing drug testing. So, if you buy something, you can go somewhere, get it tested, find out what's in it. You won't get arrested, you won't get it confiscated, and then you can make a decision on whether or not you take it, or they have amnesty bins that you can chuck it away in. And that they have, I think Holland has, a quarter of the population of the UK, and they have something like 1% the number of drug-related deaths. It's insane.
So ultimately, if you want to save lives, this is what to do, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah.
Rather
And
than this nonsense Daily Mail style scaring of things, isn't it?
This was all known way in advance, and the government didn't do anything about it. The first weekend that clubs opened, 2 people died in Bristol. It really, like, the government could solve this instantly, but they are too scared of angry opinion pieces in the Daily Mail. They would rather let, like, hundreds of young people a year die entirely avoidable deaths than risk annoying right-wing journalists. It's that simple. And so everything else kind of fades into the background, and then you get occasional, like, outrage. So there've been a couple of drug-related deaths that suddenly get this, like, massively disproportionate level of media attention, that then kind of fades away. And it's this really unhealthy, unhelpful approach to the question that means that nothing ever really gets done. And it really, of all the things related to UK dance music, that's the one thing that really makes me want to start throwing bricks through windows.
And you explain it really well. I think people could really get and understand it. It's interesting. I think that was another shock for me, because at that time I came to Brighton in '89, and so my peer group and friends, I had, literally saw friends change, like, quite, I would guess you could describe me with square people who I went to school with were suddenly taking ecstasy and changing the way they dressed, what music they listened to. I never did it. I thought it was quite expensive. That's part of the reason I would rather buy records. I wasn't that into taking drugs, really. So that was but I used to genuinely go and enjoy the music. I went to Ministry of Sounds. I had some friends taking drugs. I wasn't. I had some who weren't. I had a really good time there. So I used to sometimes think, I was a real minority. But then when I read, the stats, it wasn't just me who wasn't on drugs, and genuinely enjoying the music as well. So it's nice to read that in the book. So.
One of my weirdest club memories was at Phonic Hoop, and Bonobo was DJing, and he was just playing, like, all of these amazing, like, broken beat tunes, the stuff that I absolutely love, where it's like a little bit more stripped back, a bit more minimal, a bit more techno-y, less sort of jazzy, and I was just completely lost in it. And I had this massive argument with a guy in the toilets. So he was like, "Where can I get some pills?" And I was like, "I don't know. I've had a cup of tea this evening because I was working the door earlier, and then someone else took over and I came and had a dance." And he's like, "No, you're holding out on me. You know where the drugs are. You're having too much fun." I was like, "Really don't know what you're talking about." And it was just very strange, very awkward. This idea that, like, drugs are a kind of necessary way to, like, understand dance music is, I think, obviously, like, they do have a powerful effect, and they can totally change, like, your appreciation for something, but they're not essential in quite the same way. And I for me, like, I've taken my fair share of drugs in my time, but generally, like, most of the best dancing experiences I've had have been drug free, and, like, I've most often taken drugs, like, outside of the dance floor. Like, people have their stories of taking their first pill and it kind of changing their whole life. My first pill was a dud, like, didn't do anything at all.
And you mentioned that, but you're very honest in the book about lots of things, like, including that. Can I ask one question? Again, quite politically, you're saying things that maybe you don't necessarily, you might not necessarily, you're quite outspoken about Boiler Room, not in a bad way, and how all of these things. Have you had any pushback about the way you've said from anybody you've mentioned in the book, from what you've written, or is it all right?
No, actually, I haven't had anyone get in touch with me directly. I mean, I guess so. It's a tricky one, isn't it? I hope that the criticisms I've made in the book are measured. Like, I'm not really one for, like, hatchet jobs. Like, I think
it doesn't feel like that to me. It feels like
like I say, it's pretty clear where my tastes and interests and sympathies lie. Also, I've tried quite hard to frame the bits that are my opinion as my opinion, and the stats and the facts as something else. What I suspect is probably the case is that people who are implicitly or directly criticized might read the book and decide not to work with me. I think that's probably what might happen. That there will be doors that close because so much of the music industry is based on not pissing off the wrong people. And if I have inadvertently pissed off the wrong people, then yeah, maybe that means that opportunities that might have existed for me as a writer might not exist. But no, I haven't. The only bit of pushback I've had was when I wrote an article which kind of indirectly led, well, directly led to me getting a book deal. I wrote a piece because I live in Brixton. I wrote a piece about these DJs who I'd seen kind of making some waves in kind of the dance music scene, and then also saw one of their names connected to his property development company buying up half of Brixton Market and kind of local campaign group near to me. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. I wonder why people aren't really joining the dots between the two. So I wrote about them, and it was kind of ostensibly a review of their new record, but actually kind of dug into how you could have these like insanely wealthy people like building luxury apartment blocks with pour doors so that the rich tenants wouldn't have to cross paths with the council tenants, and then like playing house music and like building a sort of side hustle of this culture that's rooted in, you know, Black, queer, marginalized communities of varying kinds, and how much of a disconnect that was, how much their individual money kind of distorts and changes the playing field. So if you look on Companies House, their record label was like bankrolled by the property development company. Anyway, so I wrote this article, and it did quite well, and ended up with a literary agent emailing me saying, have you ever thought about writing a book? But yeah, the one bit of pushback I got was I got a very angry email from the guy who ghost wrote the record that these like posh landlord DJs had put out, saying you didn't give my production a fair hearing, you dislike these guys, so you discounted the fact. I think I described it as sounding like Play by Moby remixed by Disclosure, which he took real offense to. So that's the one time when someone's got really pushed back. Oh, and I got a terrible review in The Spectator. They commissioned Annie Nightingale of Radio 1 in the 1960s fame to review it.
To review the book?
Yeah.
Oh, right, okay.
She her angle was basically that I'm taking everything far too seriously and she needs to take me out for a pint. And it was sort of typical kind of culture war. Oh, these millennials. She manages to name drop in the review that she was mates with Andrew Weatherall and has a CBE, which is kind of a weird but very spectatory kind of balance. But yeah, so those are really the only two things where people have come back and said that I'm totally on the wrong angle. I think with the boiler room stuff, it's interesting. There are a couple of people that I really wanted to talk to, who were too scared to talk to me, which I think is telling. One person in particular, from early in boiler room's history, who I think has a very particular view on how it was founded and what happened to it.
Do you know why they're scared? Why are they scared?
Legal repercussions and personal repercussions. So the chapter of the book that had the most, so obviously the book got had a legal read, and they came back with, you know, changes that need to be made, and 90% of them related to the chapter on boiler room.
Wow.
So I had to take all of the faintly libelous stuff out there. But it was, and you know, all of the stuff that's in the book is fully kind of evidenced and backed up. And you know, I spoke to a couple of people on the record and a couple of people off the record, and you know, it's you know, there are a lot of kind of commercial interests.
Yes.
Dance music industry now, a lot of very powerful people. So you know, I don't expect any kind of serious pushback. I did actually another article I wrote once. To get threatened with legal action by a very big festival promoter, for claiming that they had not been allowed to run a festival in my local park rather than them choosing of their own volition not to, which I think was them kind of fudging the truth slightly. But yeah, it's interesting when you move from like interviewing DJs who like care about the music and produce stuff in their bedroom, and then suddenly you have these like companies backed by huge international hedge funds or like global media companies, and it's important. How dynamics there are interesting.
Yeah, it shows it's important what you're doing though. I mean, it felt like that to me. It just felt that you're trying to get just really how everything works, and it never, for me, all of these stories. I mean, you hear, you know, I love, you know, Boogie Down Productions.
Mm.
And then when I'm a bit older, you find out, okay, it's funded by a porn company. It doesn't, you know, oh God, there's going to be a bit dodgy funding and all, you know, there's a story there, but it never takes away from the cultural impact of that music. And I think it's important. And Boiler Room has done, you know, Daytimers, that would be first to say we broke through because of Boiler Room in it. So it doesn't take, but to be able to criticize and point out and say, well, look, this is, you know, this is where you're from, this is your background, this is what you've done, this is your journey that you've done, and you know, have criticism, and we accept that as, you know, even as a label, it can be really hard if someone, you know, this is one of our releases that we've done, but I love, but you have to understand that this is a personal opinion. You've got to take it on board, haven't you?
And I think that's sort of part of what I was hoping to do with the book was kind of raise some of these criticisms in a, I mean, I think it's important to be aware of like where the culture you're consuming comes from. Like we're all really interested in like eating organic food and knowing where our clothes were made. And yet when it comes to the music we listen to, often we are not particularly well informed about the mechanics of the industry behind that. And I think in terms of dance music, there's a real tendency, I think, because, you know, it's such a social art form, it's such a pleasurable art form, to treat it as just, oh, it's just a fun night out, it's just, you know, it's just some fun tunes to dance to, why take it too seriously? But actually it's, you know, it's as serious as any other form of culture or business, and it deserves just as much kind of deep, like structural discussion, and I think that.
And people in privileged positions, that they always say, oh, why are you taking it so seriously? But everything's political, isn't it? You can't say any music is not political. And it really frustrates me when people are, why are you bringing politics into it as well? And it's everything is, isn't it? And only privileged people, like, and Nightingale saying, well, what, you're taking it too seriously. It's like all of this dance music is politics, isn't it? Isn't Andrew Weather all political, isn't he? You know?
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I mean, I feel like if the Spectator had given the book 5 stars, then I would have known I was doing something wrong. So I'm not too like personally offended by any of that. But it's yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? And well, it's interesting when I interviewed quite a lot of kind of early promoters and DJs, they would say, oh, you know, we weren't thinking about doing anything political. Like we just wanted to get off our faces and have a good time. I think that's entirely valid, right? Like, but something doesn't have to be done with political intent to function politically. So, you know, someone from a aristocratic background can get engaged with dance music and go, oh, I'm not doing anything political here, and believe that, and that be entirely true in terms of its reflection of their intention and how they're approaching things. But that doesn't mean there aren't sort of political ripples that come away from that afterwards.
Well, I mean, one of my favourite hip hop labels, I found out years later, you know, it was somebody who was very rich was funding the one person to do that label, and it was like, oh, I didn't know that, but it was obviously somebody who loved hip hop and just gave him a bit of money to do that, and it's like, it doesn't take away from those records. It's not like you don't want rich people to come and support the arts and be part of it. So
Got some raucous records bankrolled by like James Murdoch. Like it's and you know, there's some great stuff on there, but it's interesting. It's I guess it's that kind of balancing act, right, between, I mean, it's the same with like the Broadwick Lives and the Printworks of the world. You get access to this great culture. I think it's reductive and simplistic to go, oh, that's bad, we shouldn't ever sell out, we should, you know, commerce and the market is inherently always wrong. I think it's great that artists get a chance to, you know, give up the day job and sustain their careers and build lives for themselves, and that labels are able to sustain themselves financially, all of that stuff. For me, it's about kind of knowing a bit more about how the sausage is made and being able to make a decision. I think if people knew where the money came from with some of these different platforms or entities, they could make more informed choices as a consumer. You know, to support their local independent label or night or radio station, rather than this entity that is secretly funded by, you know, whatever hedge fund or massive company or someone's inherited wealth. And I think being more open about that, without necessarily, you know, being kind of really kind of black and white about it, actually is a good way to think differently about where dance music's come from and where it might go in the future.
And I feel the book gets that across well. And as I said, I think you write it because you sort of know where you're coming from politically, but you're very clear about that view and the cultural impact. I mean, even things like I really liked. So you wrote about the supposed grime violence that they talk about, and then you mentioned the mass brawl at the Eagles gig at Hyde Park and saying, well, that means jangly ballads cause violence, doesn't it? And just sometimes when you do, that simple way that you've articulated a lot of things that go on, it's like, oh yeah, this is a real nonsense that continues to go on. And I think it's brilliant you do that through the history and again, the Function One theme, because the person was involved with the early Stonehenge stuff, and then Function One systems. It's like there's a thread that's gone through, isn't it?
Yeah, there's the other one that I haven't been able to completely verify, but did seem to be the case, which was really interesting to me, was so at the Stonehenge Free festivals in the 80s, because it started off kind of folk musicians and Hawkwind and all that sort of vibe. But then in the 80s, you start getting like the first kind of hip hop and funk and soul sound systems turning up. And it looks like from the kind of lineup that one of the sound systems that played in 1984, I think, at Stonehenge was called Galaxy Soul Shuffle. And from what I can find out, Galaxy Soul Shuffle was owned by a guy called Winston Silcott, who was one of the people wrongly convicted of the murder of Keith Blakelock during the Broadwater Farm riots. So played a sound system at Stonehenge in the summer, and then the riots happened in I think it's November of 1984. And there's that really interesting connection between like different, the sort of riots and unrest in inner city Britain and this kind of history of nomadic pleasure seeking and festivals and parties, and these kind of links that you wouldn't necessarily think of, those little kind of moments that help crystallize everything. The Eagles one is an interesting one too. The other one that I wanted to get in but couldn't really find space for is when people talk about kind of drill and grime lyrics and link them to specific kind of instances of violence. I think with drill, maybe there's slightly more kind of factual basis for that, but again, there's a real lack of understanding that of the kind of storytelling that goes into it, right? Nobody thinks Eric Clapton literally shot a sheriff but not his deputy. Like nobody thinks that Johnny Cash actually shot a man in Reno just to watch him die. It's understood that these are voices that artists are adopting, and yet when it comes to music made by young black men in the inner city, that same like ambiguity and flexibility is not understood as like part of their artistic craft. Which I think is kind of an interest, and another one of those kind of interesting little examples that illuminate something wider.
Okay, Ed, look, it's been really brilliant talking to you. It's really fun. I mean, I could talk to you for ages more. Look,
I was gonna say we could carry on talking for another 2 hours, but I'm sure.
Definitely, if you can, buy the book, support the book. Ask your library to order the book as well if you can't. Definitely, if you're into music and like part of the history, and you mentioned a lot of books within this, but you reference a lot of books in here as well. It feels like this is very worthy of those great sort of canons of music culture books to me, and particularly with the political aspects of what you're doing. I learned so much. I didn't really know about those free party scenes and how influential they are. Even the fact, as you said, there was a reggae sound system. I've always thought, oh, that's just folk festivals or dance music. It wasn't there's so much information there. I'm quite nerdy about reading about a lot of things. I learned so much from this book. So it's brilliant. Thank you for taking the time.
Much. It's been a real pleasure, and like a real kind of life's ambition. 18-year-old me would be so proud of getting on Unfold and getting to talk to you about all of this stuff. So thank you so much for having me. It's been really fun.
Brilliant. Do you want to mention anything that you're doing, or how people can keep in touch with you?
So I'm on Twitter and Instagram, so follow me on there. If you've got any thoughts on the book, I always love hearing from people. I don't have I've got one more talk for the book in a couple of days' time, but it'll probably have happened by the time this goes up online. But
what are your handles on Instagram and Twitter?
EH Gillett on both of them.
Okay.
Thanks very much. It's been really fun.
Thank you.